coming. I'll just make this very brief. Welcome to our lunchtime lecture today. My name is Sarah Riff. I'm the Outreach Coordinator, Undergrad Advisor for the Latin American, Caribbean, and Iberian Studies program. We do have a couple of lectures next week that I wanted to quick mention. We will add them to our website and put them in the noticias that will go out later this week. But there's a free concert for Haiti happening at St. Andrew's Episcopal Church this weekend on the 5th. That's free and open to the public. There's a man named Mona Augustine who is a musician who's here from Haiti, and it would be wonderful if people could show their support and stop into that event. On Monday, we are going to be receiving a woman from Guatemala who speaks. I just got this information, Alberto. Let's see. Sorry. And the presentation will be given in Spanish, but she's going to be here to speak about the language. And I'm quite sure.
This is Monday?
This is Monday at noon. And it probably will be in this room too. I'm just finalizing that. And then we have a native visiting scholar coming next Wednesday, Julio Cesar Perez Hernandez, who is an architect, urban planner from Havana, Cuba, who's going to be coming to talk, and our regularly scheduled lunchtime lecture on Tuesday with our Tinker visiting professor, Gustavo Gordillo, and Brad Barham. So I'll turn it over to Alberto.
Thank you, Sarah, and welcome everybody. It's my pleasure to introduce our speaker today, and one of the things that we really appreciate in classes on this series is the diversity of presenters. So we're very glad to have Jessica Kurzweil here. She has an endowed professorship in the Department of English, the Sona Gale Professorship. She's the Director of Creative Writing, and she's a prolific writer herself. She has published 13 books, and now she's going to share with us some of her most recent work, of her work in Uruguay. So join me to welcome Professor Kurzweil.
This is just going to be a very informal talk. I hope I won't cough. I've had terrible bronchitis and pneumonia, so thus the microphone probably helped. I actually have come to translation late, and therefore I feel like, all of you probably know more than I do. I was born in France. I have always spoken French and English, but I didn't start studying Spanish. I just decided to do it about 8 years ago. And I was in Mexico studying, and then I decided to take a sabbatical in 2010, 2011, and go to Uruguay and just intensively study Spanish. But I really didn't set out to translate poetry. A lot of poets translate poetry, and I kept saying I just wanted to have conversations about tomatoes. But I'm a poet, and I began to meet poets. And this particular project I'm talking about today is the Uruguayan poet Circe Maia. And Circe is 83. And so she's one of the grand poets of Uruguay. She's thought of there as one of their great poets. But I wasn't really familiar with her work until 2011. After my sabbatical, I'd gone back down to visit some friends in Uruguay in January. And January in Uruguay is summer vacation. So we were out at the beach, and for Three Kings, put out our shoes, and my Uruguayan friends gave me a copy of the complete poems of Circe Maia, because one of the man in the household is from Tacuarembó, the small northern town Circe is from. And so I sat at the beach where everyone else went to swim and read all 400 pages of her, complete works, and I just fell in love with it. I just thought it was the most amazing poetry, and because I was relatively new at translation, I couldn't wait to get back and find translations into English and give them to my poet friends. And so I got back and I found out there are about 5 of her poems in translation, a few in an anthology of Latin American women poets from the 70s. And so I thought, well, that's just not fair. I'm just burning to share her poetry. So and really the surprise was, I have to say, if I'd known more, I have these statistics which I now use to quote to publishers and make them publish translation. There's a wonderful website called 3%, which is run by the University of Rochester Translation Program, and it takes its title from the fact that only 3% of literature published in the United States is in translation. And then they further state on their website that in terms of literary fiction and poetry, the actual number is closer to 0.7%. And now, along with a lot of renewed enthusiasm for noticing how much how few women are published in general in the United States compared to men. There's a group called Women in Translation, And in October 2015, they counted the last 4 years, 2010 to 2014, by 30 major publishers who published translated work and found only 24% of those authors were women. So add all that together, and then the fact that Circe, a woman poet from Uruguay, had not been translated should not have been a surprise to me. But I wanted to translate some of her work just to send it to friends, to send it to magazines here. And so I set out to contact Circe. And the wonderful thing about Uruguay, and now they've worked more with poets there, I have to say, always true in Uruguay, if the first person doesn't know how to contact someone, the second person does. So I got Circe's email address. Circe is unusual in that she lives in Tacuarembó, which is 5 hours from Montevideo. You know, Uruguay is more like, you know, it's like Paris. Or every poet, no matter where they grew up, pretty much is in Montevideo. But Circe lives in a town that people in Uruguay often use as the definition of the middle of nowhere. But she emails. So I emailed her and she said, oh, that would be lovely. So I began translating some of her work. And then I sent it to editors at literary magazines. And these are people I know. I worked with them for years. But you know, the way this usually works is you send them your poems. And about 6 months or a year later, they might take something, or they might say no, or they might never answer. So I would email a batch of poems to someone on Sunday night, and 45 minutes later, they would take 6. So the response is really astounding, including my biggest coup, getting one in the New Yorker. So then I thought, well, okay, I guess there should be an entire book of her poems. Now, for a poet that hadn't been published in the United States yet, all 400 pages of the complete works was not a possibility. And so I ended up having a contract with the University of Pittsburgh Press for this selected poems, which, you know, I selected the ones I wanted to translate. It's from all of her books. And then it came out. I wanted to read one to start with, and I'm going to have Marcelo read it in Spanish, even though it's not an Uruguayan accent. And to save you hearing it in my accent, and then I'll read the translation. And we'll read El Puente, which is the opening poem of the book.
El puente. En un gesto trivial, en un saludo, en la simple mirada dirigida en vuelo hacia otros ojos, un áureo, un frágil puente se construye. Baste esto solo. Aunque sea un instante, existe. Baste esto solo.
There actually aren't any je words in there, are there? That's the very Uruguay je thing. The bridge. In a trivial gesture, in a greeting, in the simple glance directed in flight toward other eyes, a fragile bridge is constructed. This alone is enough. Although it is only for a moment, it exists. This alone is enough. And that poem seems very emblematic of Circe's poetry. She says that she wants to go for a poetic language that's direct, sober, open, that's not different in tone from conversation, but was a conversation in greater quality, greater intensity. And she says the mission of this language is to uncover, not to hide, to uncover the value and meaning of existence, not to usher us into a separate world requiring an exclusive and closed poetic language. And one of the things about Circe is she just tries to use the simplest possible language, and often really repeated language, the same language, all the way through her books. And the other thing that's true about her that you really sort of need to understand about her personally is that she's a high school philosophy teacher. And when I first learned that, that seemed very odd to me, because actually in the United States we don't really have high school philosophy teachers, or very few of them. But it's a required subject in Uruguay. It's a very lay country, and it's their version of ethics. And now my son spent 2 years in Uruguayan high schools. They get philosophy every year. And so she taught countless hundreds of Tacuarembese children high school philosophy in the many years that she taught. And that's really the basis of her poetry. But the other things behind her poetry, and I think everyone will be familiar with this, with Latin American poetry, especially Southern Cone poetry, is that a lot of the books were written during the dictatorship. Circe's husband, Circe was a supporter of the Tumamaras, president of the Socialist Student Union when she was in the university, and her husband was a doctor for the Tumamaras. And so, the military police broke into their house in Tacuarembó, and they were going to arrest Circe and her husband Ariel. But she had just given birth to the youngest of her 6 daughters, and so they left her, which I have to say they wouldn't have done in Argentina. And they took Ariel off to prison, and he was imprisoned for 3 years. And the only prose that Circe has written is a wonderful little novella, originally more of a memoir, but she calls it a novella, called Un viaje a Salto, which has also been translated into English, A Trip to Salto, which is about her getting on the train with her daughter. Her husband's being moved from a prison in Montevideo to a prison in Salto, and she hopes the guards will let her daughter see her husband. But because of the dictatorship, every time a poem is read in Uruguay by an Uruguayan, they'll look and see what date it was published, to see if it was written during the dictatorship. And there's one poem that's in her collected poems that was never in one of her books, because it's actually a famous song that was put to music by the Uruguayan musician Daniel Viglietti, who is often called the Bob Dylan of Latin America, but I think he's more like the Pete Seeger of South America, because he's still very active. And this is often performed, you can Google it on YouTube as Otra Voz Canta, Daniel Viglietti. It's often performed with Daniel Viglietti singing this and Mario Benedetti reciting one of his poems. And the song is called Otra Voz Canta, but the poem is called Por detrás de mi voz.
Por detrás de mi voz, por detrás de mi voz, escucha, escucha, otra voz canta. Viene de atrás, de lejos viene de sepultadas bocas y canta. Dicen que no están muertos, escúchalos, escucha, mientras se alza la voz que los recuerda y canta. Escucha, escucha, otra voz canta. Dicen que ahora viven en tu mirada, sosténlos con tus ojos, con tus palabras, que no se pierdan, que no se caigan. No son solo memoria, son vida abierta, abierta y ancha. Escucha, escucha, otra voz canta.
Behind my voice. Behind my voice, listen, listen, another voice sings. It comes from behind, from far. It comes from the buried mouths, and it sings. They say they are not dead. Listen to them, while the voice rises, remembers them, and sings. Listen, listen, another voice sings. They say they live now in your eyes. Sustain them with your eyes, with your words, so that they are not lost, so that they do not fall. They are not only memory, they are open to life, open wide. Listen, listen, another voice sings. But a more typical poem that Circe wrote up during the dictatorship, because again, she didn't have that published originally as a poem, is her poem Treason, which I think is a chilling poem about life. You don't know anything about it, but again, an Uruguayan would always hear it differently.
Traición. El último sol no le dijo, soy el último sol. Nada le previnieron. El agua resbaló sobre su cuerpo y él no supo que era el modo en que el agua decía adiós. No supo, nadie le dijo nada. Cuando llegó la noche, llegó para quedarse y él no lo supo nunca.
Treason. The last son did not say to him, I am the last son. Nothing prepared him. The water slid over his body, and he didn't know this was the way that the water said goodbye. He did not know. No one told him anything. When night came, it came to stay, and he never knew. Then there are a couple that I printed out really because I had questions about them. Circe is not really, now that I've translated a number of other Uruguayan poets, especially I've got an anthology of emerging Uruguayan poets coming out from the University of New Mexico Press next year. They are wacky crazy. They've got Lunfardo slang, they've got, they just make up stuff. It's like there's constant things you're thinking of. But Circe's stuff is relatively transparent, but people still make mistakes. When I said that, that I found a couple of her poems translated in an early women's anthology, translated by Mary Crow, who's a very good translator. One of her very early poems, which are longer and sort of more about the environment around, the landscape around Tacuarembó, is called Donde Había Barrancas. And Mary Crow is from Colorado and translates a lot of Mexican poetry, translated that as where there are wastelands. I think thinking of sort of a desert image, of canyons in the Southwest, but it made me wonder whether she read the poem because it's about someone canoeing on a river. And a barrancas in Uruguay is just sort of a steep, eroded riverbank. And that's a kind of constant problem with, translating, I think, all of Latin American poetry, which is that every country has its particular thing. And Rio Platense Spanish especially is like that, every different word for every kind of food, different word for every kind of clothes. That plant is not this plant. That expression doesn't mean this. And so I started translating in this tiny macro way where I actually think I actually know every single living Uruguayan poet now. I think I could say that. And I've read all the Uruguayan poetry, and then I started to move out to Argentina. So I didn't start with Golden Age Spanish poetry and move forward. It's kind of a weakness, which I'm making up for now. But it does mean that I don't tend to miss those things. And with the young people, you just ask, okay, so this guy in the corner selling something, he's not a tinsmith. What kind of drugs is he selling? But you don't tend to have those problems with Circe's things. But you do have just questions. And so the poems that I put in the packet next were really just ones where you make a choice, and then I look back at the book and I think, oh, I don't know about that. And I have to remember that translating for me is sort of like, playing Beethoven. I say that as someone who doesn't play an instrument. But imagine that I'm a classical concert pianist, and you know that every time someone plays it, it's going to be different. So there's no definitive translation. I would be delighted for someone to come along and do more translations of Circe. And the ones that I give examples of were signos, and I'll just point out what I wanted to say. I don't really need to read them out loud since they're in your packet. But the kind of questions that you sit there and think about. Well, maybe it would be good.
64?
Yeah, 64. I didn't warn Marcelo about that.
Signos. Los signos de pregunta. Los ganchos de las interrogaciones como anzuelos van y vuelven vacíos. Renuncia. El agua, el aire mismo y hasta la luz son claras respuestas a otros signos.
And the choices with that were really just simple. Again, with Circe stuff, it's often just thinking about something very small, which is that she's got two different words for hooks. And so I made a choice to say question marks, barbs, interrogation, like fish hooks go and return empty, because I didn't want to say question marks, hooks of interrogation, like fish hooks go and return empty. And I question it sometimes because actually a real tendency in American poets don't like to use the same noun, verb, or adjective twice in an entire poem, really. And it's because in English you don't have to. You just have endless variation. And Spanish poets are not averse to it, and the language doesn't tend to lend itself to that, and Circe is even more that way. But I think that if she had wanted to say the same word twice, she'd have used the same word twice, and in this case she doesn't. But I don't know that she wouldn't have preferred the other. So I look at that one and think, a more sort of radical change, which actually was the one time that Circe actually wrote me a note and said she really loved my choice. She reads English perfectly. She translates Shakespeare into Spanish. We never speak in Spanish, and she doesn't tend to want to talk about her poetry at all. So when I go visit her in Tacuarembó, we sit in her garden, and if I bring her the stacks of magazines that her work has been in, she reads the other poets, or she reads the cartoons in the New Yorker. And she likes to read my poems and ask questions, but she will just not talk about her poetry. But this particular poem, I made a different choice, and she actually wrote me an email and said she particularly liked it. And that one's in your packet too. We won't read it. I think I'll just... I can find it. Page 80. Which is about what seemed to me the false friend of una horrible impresión. And I went for a horrible shock. I think that's a little stronger. I might have said, a sinking sensation, I think is what she's talking about. But I just felt that the sensation she was feeling was stronger than that. So I would say that was a case where I really feel maybe I pushed the poem a little in a certain direction. But the other words, sensation, feeling, a horrible sensation, were just so weak in English that I didn't like them. But that's one where I could imagine passing it out to a class of people and everyone having come up with a different title for this poem. So I'm going to have Marcelo read a couple of poems with me, and then we'll have some time for questions. And one of the ones we just have to read, one of my favorites, actually, the one that was in New York. Which hardly ever publishes translation. Paul Muldoon, the poetry editor for the New Yorker, is from Ireland, but somehow that doesn't count.
Colibríes. Creí que me hablaba exagerando un poco cuando decía que cada uno de sus colibríes, tenía 5, tenía un nombre distinto y que volaban libremente por su jardín, donde tenían bebederos distintos. Si no, pelean mucho. Pero era así mismo. Los vi una vez cuando la casa sola invitaba a ser visitada por el fondo abierto. Allí entraban volando como unos diminutos mensajeros alados con urgentes avisos y advertencias. Ningún nombre les quedaba del todo bien. Palabras inútiles. Asombro del velocísimo moverse de las alas. El no poder mirarlas al acercarse con sus corazoncitos latiendo rapidísimamente, cerca, muy cerca, y disparar de pronto, altísimo, inalcanzables. Seres de nuestro mundo, pero también de otro, solo de ellos.
Hummingbirds. I thought she was exaggerating a little when she said that every one of her hummingbirds, she had 5, had a distinct name and that they flew freely in her garden where they had distinct feeders. If not, they fight too much. But it was like that, just like that. I saw them once when the house, alone, invited a visit to the open back garden. There they came flying like tiny winged messengers with urgent notices and warnings. No name fit them well. Useless words. Astonishment at the rapid movement of the wings, the not being able to look at them, the approach of their tiny hearts beating so incredibly rapidly, close, very close, then suddenly shooting off, high, unattainable. Beings of our world, but also of another, only theirs. The last 2 poems, to me, are very much Tacuarembó and then Circe's house. Tacuarembó is a city of low 2-story houses with walled back gardens, and very different than Montevideo, which is pretty much a city of giant condominiums. And so this poem seems to me very, very, very Tacuarembó.
Ciudad de casas bajas. Las calles desembocan fácilmente en el cielo. Detrás de las palmeras de la plaza se pone el sol. El rojo se ensombrece en violeta allí, muy cerca. Y encima de las casas, nubes, a veces largas franjas, o las algodonosas con los bordes brillantes. Todo allí mismo, tocando techos bajos. Hay esquinas donde la luz demora y se prende a un balcón y lo suelta sin ganas. El cielo toca todo y entra por todos lados. ¿Qué haremos con tanto azul tan cerca?
City of low houses. The streets flow easily into the sky. Behind the palm trees in the plaza, the sun sets. Red shadows to purple. There, very near. And above the houses, clouds, sometimes large stripes or cotton ones with brilliant edges, all right there, touching low roofs. The light catches on the corners, lingers on the corners, catches on a balcony, then reluctantly lets go. The sky touches everything, enters everywhere. What shall we do with so much blue, so close? The last poem, which is actually one of the few poems that's out of order in the book. The book mostly is in sort of chronological order, but I had to move this poem to last because it seemed to close the book so well. And it's a philosophical book about a poem about a conversation between the poet and the reader, but it's also sad to say because if you show up at her doorstep in Tacuarembó, no matter who you are, she just takes you through the house and into the garden and sits and talks to you. And everyone sort of makes the pilgrimage, which is, by the way, a 5-hour bus ride from Montevideo up to Tacuarembó to talk to Circe, and you sit under her lemon tree in her backyard. And so this poem means that to me, as well as her lovely sort of openness to the reader.
Invitación. Me gustaría que me oyeras la voz y yo pudiera oír la tuya. Sí, sí, hablo contigo, mirada silenciosa que recorre estas líneas. Y repruebas tal vez este imposible deseo de salir del papel y la tinta. ¿Qué nos diríamos? No sé, pero siempre mejor que el conversar a solas dando vuelta a las frases, a sonidos, el poner y el sacar paréntesis y al rato colocarlos de nuevo. Si tu voz irrumpiera y quebrara esta misma línea, adelante, ya te esperaba, pasa, vamos al fondo, hay algunos frutales, ya verás, entra.
Invitation. I would like you to hear my voice, wish I could hear yours. Yes, yes, I am talking to you, silent gaze that runs over these lines. You disapprove, perhaps, of this impossible desire to escape paper and ink. What will we say to each other? I don't know, but it has to be better than always talking to myself, turning phrases, sounds, placing and removing parentheses and putting them in again. If your voice interrupts and breaks this very line, come in. I was waiting for you. This way. Let's go into the garden. There are fruit trees. You will see. Come. So now I would like you to ask me questions. Yeah.
So I'm just blown away with the fact that you said you just started learning Spanish 8 years ago and you're able to translate poetry. That's pretty mind-boggling. I just wondered do you have any special techniques you use to...
Well, what I would say to students who are probably not the students in this room, they're the ones who are surly in your Spanish 100 classes. I was always very bad in language classes in school. I mean, I took French all the way through. I took Russian in undergraduate. And I tended just to be the kind of person who sat behind a fat kid trying not to get called on. I hate to say that. Because I didn't have the patience for the memorization. But what I did, I went to Mexico with my daughter, who'd always studied Spanish, to stay with a Mexican family in Guanajuato and go to one of those language schools. And I just realized that when it's all around you, you can learn it. This is why we send kids on overseas semesters. And so I just thought, if I can go, I will do it. But during my sabbatical year, I took 8 hours of Spanish a day. I was seriously studying it. And I also tried not... It was also hard because I was with my husband and my son, who was in high school down there, and so we were speaking English at home, and on the weekends it's bad. So, better to go and get yourself a second husband and speak Spanish. But so I just relentlessly built up Uruguayan friends. So my first friends from there, they're not poets. I couldn't have. I remember standing in a bookstore there and thinking I couldn't read a book. I mean, I could have, but I mean, not. I couldn't have picked up a really serious novel and made my way through it without a lot of trouble. And so they were just ordinary people. A pharmacist, my son's teacher. We're still great friends, and I would just go to, first I went to a lot of music with them, because you can go to music, and then finally be able to go to plays and movies, and just pushed myself hard on it. And when I was back here, I would always have a tutor from your department. I usually managed to get an Argentinian. I never found an Uruguayan here. And I would just work with them. And the translation is actually less hard than the speaking. So at my age, if I start learning Spanish when I'm 50, I always sound like a wacky foreign professor, and they're very charitable about that. My model when I went down there was my son took fencing here in town at the Cracovia School of Olympic Foil Fencing. Anybody's kid taking fencing? And the woman who does it is Polish, and she's lived here for I don't know how many years, and her English is horrible. And yet she runs a business, and she hugs everyone, and everyone loves her, and she just does it. So I think I've now seen it. I'm not Christina anymore, but that was kind of my model to start with. The translation is different because you have lots of time to do it. I'm translating into English, which is my mother tongue, and all of my years of poetry really came to my aid. So that from the beginning, when I would go to poetry readings, when, for example, it was hard for me to go to a play and understand it.
Planner from Havana, Cuba, who's going to be coming to talk, and our regularly scheduled lunchtime lecture on Tuesday with our Tinker visiting professor Gustavo Gordillo and Brad Barham. So I'll turn it over to Alberto.
Thank you, Sarah, and welcome everybody. It's my pleasure to introduce our speaker today. And one of the things that we really appreciate in classes on this series is the diversity of presenters. So we're very glad to have Jessie Kirchwell here. She has an endowed professorship in the Department of English, the Sona Gale Professorship. She's the Director of Creative Writing, and she's a prolific writer herself.
That event. On Monday, we are going to be receiving a woman from Guatemala who speaks. I just got this information, Alberto. Let's see. Sorry. And the presentation will be given in Spanish, but she's going to be here to speak about the language and. I'm quite sure.
This is Monday?
This is Monday at noon, and it probably will be in this room too. I'm just finalizing that. And then we have a Nave visiting scholar coming next Wednesday, Julio Cesar Perez Hernandez, who is an architect, urban.
And I was in Mexico studying, and then I decided to take a sabbatical in 2010, 2011, and go to Uruguay and just intensively study Spanish. But I really didn't set out to translate poetry. A lot of poets translate poetry, and I kept saying I just wanted to have conversations about tomatoes. But I'm a poet, and I began to meet poets. And this particular project I'm talking about today is the Uruguayan poet Circe Maia. And Circe is 83, and so she's one of the grand poets of Uruguay. She's thought of there as one of their great poets. But I wasn't really familiar with her work until 2011, after
coming. I'll just make this very brief. Welcome to our lunchtime lecture today. My name is Sarah Riff. I'm the Outreach Coordinator, Undergrad Advisor for the Latin American, Caribbean, and Iberian Studies program. We do have a couple of lectures next week that I wanted to quick mention. We will add them to our website and put them in the noticias that will go out later this week. But there's a free concert for Haiti happening at St. Andrew's Episcopal Church this weekend on the 5th. That's free and open to the public. There's a man named Mona Augustine who is a musician who's here from Haiti, and it would be wonderful if people could show their support and stop into that.
She has published 13 books, and now she's going to share with us some of her most recent work of her working in Uruguay. So join me to welcome Professor Kirchwell.
This is just going to be a very informal talk. I hope I won't cough. I've had terrible bronchitis and pneumonia, so thus the microphone probably helped. I actually have come to translation late, and therefore I feel like, all of you probably know more than I do. I was born in France. I've always spoken French and English, but I didn't start studying Spanish. I just decided to do it about 8 years ago.